Yeah, I'm Jim Wert. I struggle as a management consultant enough, so I am not a lawyer. That would be a cross too big to bear. It's good to be with you guys. I was really tempted as we got going to kind of go around the room because we really haven't had a chance to introduce one another. We've already kind of gotten the flavor that there are sessions and sessions, and there are churches and churches. Everything is different, and how you deal, for example, with a discipline case could look really different at Perimeter Church versus Ray Holton's church in Brookwood. So I'm not going to do that, but what I am going to do is get you to write down two numbers for me. The first one is your rating of your session's health, however you define that. And a 1 is Death Valley, and a 10 is like your version of Eden. You pick your favorite botanical garden. So I'm interested in and don't overthink it, but if you had to give your session today a rating on a health scale, 1 to 10, what would it be? All right? So write down a number real quickly. Don't overthink it. Now you got one? The second question is, as you think about your next session meeting, what is your level of excitement about going to that session meeting? Where a 1, and apologies to my dentist, is a root canal. Sorry, and a 10 is like Disney World or tickets to the Final Four, or whatever your version of euphoria is.
So the first scale
depends on who's playing. Yeah, so both are 1 to 10. 1 to 10. Okay? So everybody got that down? And I realize some of you are brand new. My friend in the back is a brand new elder at In Town. So, yeah, Jason. Yeah, so he doesn't have to.
He knows how to fix it.
He does. He does. So I'm interested on the first question in terms of your rating of session health. And I realize that there may be a lot of guys here on the same session, particularly at this church, is my hunch. And it'll be interesting as you kind of raise your hands. But if you were at a kind of a 1 to 3 on that level, would you raise your hands? On the health question. How healthy is my session? Somewhere on the Death Valley-ish side of things. An honest man. Sorry?
3's on Death Valley.
1 is Death Valley.
1 to 10.
Yeah. 1 is low. How many 4s to 7s? So most of you are falling there. Any 8, 9, 10s in the room? That's good. Well, maybe you should be up here. As far as your level of excitement of going to the next session meeting, 1s to 3s in there, in terms of, this is very close to a root canal.
I need to qualify mine, though.
Yeah.
I'm old and I live 35
All right, well,
church, and
it's just pure
I
logistics.
drive to church and back, yeah.
All right. And how many 4s to 7s in there? How many 8, 9, 10s? That's good.
Once I get there.
So one of the things that I hope you're seeing is that there's a broad range. And
I think you said the second one was 1 to 5.
1 to 10.
It's 2 to 5.
Well, I'm not trying to overthink it, just trying to get into it. So one of the lessons there is that, and by the way, if I'd asked that question, 2 months from now, you may be in a completely different spot. It's a dynamic kind of a question. It's not static. So I have a few caveats. At the end of his discussion, Bob, not Cargo, talked about discipline, and we have to work as a team on this. Well, what in the world does that mean? And how do sessions function? So my charge is to talk about session health and trying to create session health. And that's a challenging charge. So some opening caveats on that. All sessions are different. They come in all sizes, ages, history of your church, experience with churches, history of your senior pastor. There is no one-size-fits-all kind of a question or solution to this space. And I want to recognize that. So that's why I'm more interested in kind of running through my prepared remarks quickly so that we can get to an interaction and question and answer time. Second, I know that Rob talked about how biblical our form of governance is. And I truly believe that. But let's face it, we are trying to be governance by committee. And that is inherently a challenging, difficult thing. As opposed to, let's just pick a leader. And is sort of, I've heard one denomination call it the Mosaic model of leadership. Send Moses to the mountain. Moses comes back with tablets, and we'll follow Moses. There are varying degrees and differing forms of how each of us engages in the church. Our several responsibilities is the way that the Book of Church Order talks about it. And so we're all going to bring different degrees of engagement and perspective and facets of what we know and what we love, also informed by our individual giftedness to that session. We are inherently a diverse body with limited information about the whole as we approach this idea of being elders with one another. There is in our governance a temptation toward projecting civility and projecting unity while preserving the mandate for constructive conflict. It's intention. So we're going to be friendly and Christian with one another, but we also ought to figure out how we disagree with one another. The first, or one of the first session meetings in the New Testament that I can tell at the Council of Jerusalem was exactly like that. It was a roll up your sleeves, a bit of a bare knuckling debate over the whole circumcision question and what kind of law was going to extend to Christians in this new dispensation, the post-resurrection kind of understanding of what the church was and what Gentiles were up to in this dynamic. And so you see that same kind of tension between unity and combativeness, candidly. And it's what we've got. There is a seductive nature of pride and power. We talked about this on the discipline case. That's power struggles. It takes two to have a power struggle. And we as elders, I as an elder will quickly confess, I do like to fix, but I also like to be right all the time. And if I let that capture my heart, then I am going to exhibit power and pride. You can see that with the disciples. These are guys that have Jesus every day. And their debate, as they're walking along, is which one of us is the best. It's not even, we don't even have to be careful about that. It is almost automatic. We have to militate against that kind of a spirit and that kind of an attitude with one another. There is an inherent difficulty in our challenge. The discipline case shows it. And that's just one area. The messy, hard stuff is what lands on our desk or in our session meetings. I mean, amen. May God increase the number of member-to-member discipline conversations that are going on. But that means that the messy ones, the hard ones, the challenging ones, the power struggle ones are going to show up in session. And, welcome to your world. Sorry, Jason. It's our world. It's kind of like what Moses did when he said, well, I'm going to get a lot of people to handle the easy cases, and the hard ones are going to come to me. And we'll figure them out. So that is our charge. And we have to embrace that. So as we embrace that, this was a quote. I actually used this to a young assistant pastor back in 2010 at InTown, Steve Yang. And I stole it from Tim Keller as a quote. It says, most churches make the mistake of selecting as leaders the confident, the competent, and the successful. But what you really need as leaders are those who have been broken by the knowledge of their sin and have been grounded in an even greater knowledge of Jesus' costly grace. The best leaders, the most spiritually mature people in every church, ought to be the people who repent most fully without excuses, the most easily without bitterness, the most publicly and the most joyfully because they know their standing isn't based on their performance. Well, that is personally convicting to me. And it's a quote. If I think I will hand out something. I'll give you that quote so you can roll around in that as you think about your callings. We talked about, what about if there's an issue? One of you as elders, Bob said 80% of guys, that's the statistic, are looking at pornography. Well, we're a bunch of guys, and there's a percentage, and that probably includes us. So how do we deal with that? Probably, if you're like me, in petrified privacy. Do we have a session that would allow us to exhibit this kind of bold and free repentance with one another? How in the world do we get to that? And it's not just saying, okay, guys, we're going to do that with one another. You know that. I don't know if I trust you guys enough. I don't know if you're going to keep the confidences enough. The minute that I expose myself on that or any other part of my life that is less than perfect, becomes a potential tool or weapon in your hands, doesn't it? So, and that's the kind of exposure that we potentially have with one another as fellow elders working in the church. Another caveat, there's no silver bullet. Sorry. I don't have a handout with all the checklists of stuff to do. Or for that matter, even a common definition of what healthy means. When I asked you to do your ratings and use the silly Death Valley to Eden, that's a metaphor. How do you define health? When you think about your interactions, your fruitfulness, your degree of trust, your respect in the congregation, your personal growth spiritually and emotionally, and in discipline and in your responsibilities as an elder. Yeah, it's kind of like art. It's kind of like pornography. We can't. I'm not sure I can define it, but I know it when I see it. The best way may be in contrasting those episodes when you know as a session you're not being healthy. And then thinking about the times when, if we could just get rid of that, or when we manage to avoid those sorts of pitfalls with one another, that may be the best way to define health. But it's hard. We know that it takes time to get healthy. It's not mechanical, it's organic. And by that I mean it's not like I can bolt something on or add a checklist or create a process or just have good agendas in front of meetings or whatever that is, not to discount any of that, but it's more organic. It is like what it takes to cultivate a garden. And just like a garden, if you dump 2 tons of manure on the garden, it doesn't mean things will grow faster. It's a process as I think about pursuing health. It takes rigorous and even painful self-examination. I'm going to talk about that in a second as it relates to my in-town case study on it. And it takes, obviously, the Holy Spirit. There is no progress towards health. And so the best mechanic is to think about how do we invite the Holy Spirit into our connection and our relationship and our processes, into our meetings. And obviously that means a whole lot of prayer, I hope. Finally, in these opening thoughts, there are some things that your sessions are not. And you need to be careful about these things. Sessions, how many of you guys are coming out of a business background of some kind? Some kind of a business background. I've worked, in small or large businesses. Many of us ruling elders are coming from that kind of a perspective. And it is really tempting to think of my service on a session as kind of working on a business meeting. I'm doing the business of the church. And it's not less than that. We are doing the business of the church. But if that is my model, my paradigm of what it means to be a session, we kind of get together and we list our agenda items and we knock things off and we're great problem solvers, then I'm missing it. I am. If that's all I'm thinking about, I have to expand my thinking. We candidly are not governance boards, and I work with a lot of ministries in my work. The problem is, unlike a governing board, as sessions, we are actively engaged in the life and ministries and day-to-day activities and week-to-week activities of a church. As opposed to, anybody sit on a nonprofit board in here? So, flying in 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, or being on a conference call, to think about policies and high-level decisions and strategies and those kinds of things. We're, unlike a typical nonprofit board that is heads in, hands off, sessions are heads in, hands on. So it's real tempting, and it's natural to become operationally meddling. Pretty interesting when I talk to some of my executive pastor and senior pastor friends who get frustrated by that fact because they know that elders just love to make the calls on programmatic kinds of things. And yet, candidly, we do not have the day-to-day, week-to-week experience, the exposure to all of the staff conversations that may have gone on, assuming you have more than one staff, or all the thinking and praying. So there is a great potential to be highly disruptive, and particularly to get intensely micromanagement oriented. It's just natural because we're elders. We're part of that life of the church. And yet we're still the keepers of the keys. We vote on new member acceptance on purpose. It's part of our charge. But we're more than governance boards. Rob started us out with a question about our elected representatives. And it's easy to think about being on a session. That can be another pitfall for us. If we're thinking of ourselves as representing certain constituents within our congregation. Certainly in our sessions, we want diversity of backgrounds. It could be in geographic communities that are represented, that are in the circle of our church. It could be in terms of age and stage of life. It could be ethnicity or socioeconomic kinds of background. It's great to have that kind of diversity until it comes to the point where I see myself as the champion of this ministry, that people group, this history era of our church that I'm going to protect and preserve. And if we devolve to that kind of factionalism, which is candidly what it is, then there is an inherent real risk that we may be battling over the wrong things or blinded to that kind of personal orientation or conviction. And then finally, we're more than just advisory panels. Particularly if you've got a really strong staff or senior pastor within your circle. If we see ourselves as we're just here to soldier on and help pastor, accomplish the vision. I don't know about you, that's not my problem. I tend to chime in anyway. But if we see our role as primarily advisory, then, as opposed to being owners or charged as shepherds of the flock, then we lose a step in terms of our effectiveness. So those are just the opening things. You're on low battery here. Does that matter?
We'll survive.
Okay.
I don't deploy.
All right. Second major point, the inevitability of trauma. The inevitability of trauma. Do I need to talk a lot about that? Are you guys already coming in convinced about that?
Trauma or trauma?
Trauma.
Yep.
Trauma. And drama. Dramatic trauma.
Are you talking about having teenagers?
Yeah. Guys, I'm assuming that you have all been through it. And whatever it is can be horrible. I have a refugee friend from Venezuela who became a citizen of Canada. And she, as she's reflected over 5 years, said these things. A meaningful, fruitful life is not made of happy moments. Old hearts can't house new life. Life is made of seasons. Things need pruning. Slow progress is still progress. broken is not bad. And as I wrote through it, because she was reflecting on the challenges as she has had to move into that environment, I thought, wow, that's a really good list as I think about what life on a session looks like in terms of a healthy session is not necessarily a happy session. What? Going through the seasons of trauma could be exactly what God is taking your church through. And how we manage and how we preserve relationship in those kinds of environments is really, really important. So I want to talk about briefly an era at InTown, just as a case study. You know this is true, by the way, if you look at Revelation, in those churches in Revelation. Which are the ones that actually get commended without any of those, yet I have this against you, condemnations? There are a couple. Smyrna and Philadelphia are the two churches which seem to be under the heaviest persecution and the greatest amount of poverty. It's the ones that feel like we are smart, happy, beautiful, that seem to get the most austere correction as Jesus talks to his churches. And I think that's still true for us. In 2008, 9, 10 at InTown, I don't know how many of you know the InTown story. I'm not going to go deeply into it. Post our founding pastor, not Bob Carter era, we went through all kinds of factionalism and trauma as a church. And as we got into our third senior pastor and started to get into even more challenges as a session there, we established a little committee and did a lot of self-reflection. And these were the things that we told ourselves. So see how many of these things are true for you. InTown pathologies, circa 2010. We fail to shepherd well. We have acted more as demanding executives and or consumers than as co-laborers and co-pastors. We have not partnered well in this way with our staff. We have been reactive rather than proactive in caring for the InTown flock. We have favored task and doing over relationship and being. We have, an idolatrous pursuit of peace. We have sought to maximize the appearance or facade of congregational happiness, covered over or minimized problems that demanded aggressive engagement, and marginalized critics. We have compromised in our leadership clarity because of our desire to be liked. We have been more fearful about losing congregants and budget dollars than we have about seeking God and his desires and vision for impact. Third, we have had pride and self-reliance on our own agendas and control. We've relied more on our own strength and competence than on God's favor, blessing, and timing. We have been angry and or fearful about the possible loss of respect as leaders and elders. We have difficulty admitting that we're wrong, including in our assessment of staff performance, which makes us difficult and even stiff-necked to lead. We have lacked faith in God's provision. We have not prayed or fasted enough. Fourth, we have divisiveness and disloyalty. We have not co-labored well among ourselves as elders and with our staff, nor submitted to one another well. We have explicitly and implicitly behaved and spoken in ways that have contributed to factionalism and division within our body. We have acted with suspicion toward ministries and people with which we disagree or don't understand. We have failed to practice Matthew 18 enough, and we have personal issues with fellow elders and staff and been guilty of gossip and bad reports. And then finally, sloth. We have been guilty of checking out, being over-reliant on staff, and treating InTown and our role as elders more as an avocation than a call. Anybody recognize anything, or is that just us?
Is that a template?
It could be. This was the result of
serious soul searching, prayer, the invitation for others to come in and critique us, some of whom are in this room, looking at you. It was unpleasant to get to this level of candor with one another. The results of those pathologies at Midtown, I mean, pragmatically, we went from 800 plus congregants to 300. We experienced a loss of 4 plus pastoral staff, teaching elders, to 0 full-time pastoral staff. We went from a session of 30 plus to 12. We had a 25% or more hit to our budget. We've been in our building for roughly 20 years, and we started talking about the need to sell it. So, we forget the spiritual damage that was happening between brothers who in theory had made vows to submit to one another. This was the reality that we were having to go through. That dark nights of soul and valleys that we were having to tread through as sessions. I'll fast forward to our last session meeting, like a week or two ago, where in our current body of elders, some in tears have said to one another, I have never experienced a healthier, more encouraging environment and relationship as elders than I am right now. It's a miracle of God.
Praise the Lord.
So how do you get from there to there, back to there? That kind of trough that we've been going through. And I can report we have financial stability. We've rebuilt our pastoral staff. We just hired a 4th teaching elder. We have a new growing singles ministry, thanks to people like Jason. Prayer is a cornerstone and vital component of our church. At least for now, factionalism and a gossiping spirit in the congregation seems to be in remission. I think it's always a cancer that we have to monitor. And that's been true for the last year or 3. So how do we get from here to there? So I want to talk about 2 areas. My sort of pragmatic list, kind of along the lines of, Bob took us through his list of stuff for discipline reminders. And I'll divide it into a couple of categories. And then I really do want to open it up. I might show you two books that are resources. First category is how do we recover a healthy session dynamic if we find ourselves in those dark nights, in the trough or in the valley. And then the second one is how do we sustain a healthy session dynamic. And this is where I really want to not assume that InTown has it figured out at all. And I'm more interested in getting your thoughts and comments and questions on it. But a few thoughts to prime the pump. In terms of recovering a healthy session dynamic, pray. Pray again. Pray some more. Then start thinking about praying some. It is absolutely critical, absolutely vital. It's that kind of repentance quote that I gave you from Tim Keller. Your recovery as a session will start nowhere else, and then the second point is repent. Repentance and prayer as a session. It is exactly the Sermon on the Mount. Find the beams in our eyes first. And if it's a problem in intra-sessional dynamics, find the beams in my eyes first. And look for them again. Get others to help me look for them. So prayer and repentance are absolutely critical. If you have to spend a year in that, great. Connected to that is the importance of listening to one another. It is an absolute fact that many, most, all of us are fixers. And so if I've got a problem in the church or a problem in my session, I want to skip ahead. It's not a good meeting unless I've got the 12 action steps at the end of it that are going to get me out of this, isn't it? I do not have the patience to rest in the prayer and the repentance and the listening nearly long enough. Because I'm going to assume that I've got the data points around. I don't need more data points. It's time to get on to action, solutions, It's what elders do. It wasn't for us. Wade into the mess. You know, Bob talked about that in terms of discipline cases. But that is absolutely true in disunity issues, tension and disagreement kinds of issues with one another. And do it earlier rather than later. What is it, Winston Churchill says that when you find yourself in hell, keep going. Yeah, it's that, but recognize it could be a long slog. But also, we're good Presbyterians. Recognize this is where God has us. What's the point of being a Calvinist if you can't relax, even in the mess? Work problems and systems more than people. It is really, really tempting in eras of disunity or of those dark nights of the soul to say we are just one staff move away from fixing this problem. Or if we can only get this person, this gossip monger, out of our church, or if we could just, maybe put that elder on sabbatical for a year or 7. That is going to solve it for us. And I assure you, well, there are absolutely times when that kind of action has to be taken. But for the most part, we need to do a whole lot more examining of our own hearts and the structure and the system and the dynamic and the culture that has created the pathologies that we're seeing. Otherwise, we will make that move, and that person or that elder will leave, and then lo and behold, someone else will come in and start acting exactly in the same ways that we saw happening elsewhere. It was just a vacuum that's going to get filled. So we have to think about and examine those kinds of root causes of the mess and work those problems in prayer and repentance. Remind and refresh yourselves on our foundations. Go back to base metal. It may require that we do some simplifying along the way. But questions like, why are we here? What is our community like? If we got out of this introverted, navel-oriented self-examination, and we have to do some of that, if we turn our eyes outward, what's our mission and purpose here? And how do I subordinate my own agenda to that larger calling that we have as a church? What has God called us to do? What defines us uniquely? Let's talk about those things and see what kind of common ground that we can get on, or what kind of redefinition that we need as a church. Those are healthy kinds of things. I may need to make tough decisions. And I need to make them for the right reasons, as opposed to that I just got to fix something or tweak something little. But it may mean that I have to think about really ratcheting back on programs and get down to just a few simple things, simple church kind of stuff, to focus that energy and that attention. I may need to make hard budgeting calls. I may need to make hard staff moves. I may need to do some congregational discipline in certain cases. Bob talked about discipline cases. Some of the hardest ones involve sex addiction. I'll tell you one that we hardly ever do is sin in the area of gossip. Sin in the area of spreading bad reports. It's hard to pin down. It's so hard to overlook or minimize or hope that it'll go away. So there are those kinds of tough decisions which may have to happen after we do all the listening and repentance and the prayer and stuff. One of the things that we found at InTown as we tried to work through those valleys was the need to be more transparent, not less transparent, with our congregation, including about the kinds of things that we were doing as a church. It is really, really tempting, especially if there are tensions or issues within a session, to treat us as Las Vegas. It's all going to stay here in-house. And if we show that we have problems to the church, that's going to expose our weakness, our lack of wisdom, those kinds of things. the church knows. The church knows. And how we choose to be transparent becomes really, really important. Now, do not fight in front of your church is a corollary to that. And we had that issue at Intel. We let ourselves get so pathologically out of whack that we would have those kinds of elder to elder across a congregational meeting, kinds of, it wasn't exactly shouting, but we were firmly convicting one another about our separate thoughts of what was happening and what was the right way to act. Don't do that. Retain unity, but also be willing, back to that repentance thing, be willing to expose and repent in front of the congregation. Be willing to say, this is the reality of our budget. Or we have to let so-and-so go if it's one of those tough decisions that you have to get through. So that was a really uncomfortable, painful lesson to learn along our way. The last one, and I'm not just saying this as a consultant, but be willing or consider getting outside help. If you and your session are in a mire, it is really hard to quickly get the altitude or the outside perspective that is able to look at lots of angles versus, I'm going to see it through my angle. I cannot be objective, candidly. Try my hardest. I tell myself I'm going to be. So for us, there in some of those dark nights, there were people in our presbytery, like Rob Ringstra, and like you and Kennedy, and like Al LaCour, and others that came alongside, ultimately like Terry Geiger, who became our interim pastor, that were absolutely critical in the perspective and in just the ear of listening and in the interpretation. And they didn't even have to solve all of our problems. But having those kinds of external perspectives was really important and critical as we worked through some of our dark nights. In the sustaining a healthy session dynamic, a few more thoughts. If there's nothing else that I would pass along to you is this. Invest in deep, heart-level relationship building with one another. Invest in deep, heart-level relationship building in one another. So, for example, one of the practices that we started doing in Intel, at the encouragement of one of our ruling elders, was that before, it used to be now it's every other session we do, we will share in email form the state of our hearts with one another. And the degree of candor and of exposure that we have been able to develop over time with one another as elders has been startling. It has been remarkable. And then we'll spend every other meeting the first 45 minutes to an hour in covering one another, talking about the things that we've learned about one another, and then in prayer for one another before we ever get to a lick of the meeting. Now, you might think, boy, that's a lot of time. When do you get to your business? It accelerates the business. And it absolutely transforms the dynamic of the conversation. We have had session meetings where we deferred and said, we will get to the business afterwards. What we are accomplishing here in terms of building trust-based relationships, honesty, integrity, being for one another, has multiplying effects in terms of the ability to do something like establish a subcommittee. If I absolutely trust not only your competence but your heart as a fellow elder, man, when your subcommittee comes back with a report, I know that you're going to tell me the truth. I know that I'm not going to have to doubt your motives or that you didn't dig far enough, because we've been digging into one another's lives on these kinds of things, especially if it's a hard thing like a discipline case. Our effectiveness as a team starts with trust and vulnerability with one another. And you're not going to achieve that just by saying, I trust you. I'm vulnerable to you. Now let's move on to the first item of business. It happens over time It happens with investment. But I now know that I've got 11, and I'm hoping 12 now with Jason, other guys who will absolutely go to war for me if I need them to, who I can actually be candid and confessional with if I need to be with them, and know that it's going to stay within that circle as I get them to help me. As a leader, as an elder, as a husband, as a whatever. So please hear that. Consider it. How do you invest in one another's lives? Make it a routine pulse for yourselves. To do that, I would encourage you to maybe consider meeting more frequently, but more briefly. We have found that the pulse, and there was an era over probably 3 years or more, where we met every week as a session. Now, part of that was because we were in an interim situation and we were in crisis, that all those statistics I rattled off. But part of it is we were working on the relationships with one another. And what we came to was a pattern of a brief amount of time on just business items, ideally, that we could knock off quickly. One big theme that we were working on during that meeting. And then at the front end, that prayer and heart sharing with one another. And that became the pulse. And we were pretty serious when we said we're going to meet we meet on Sunday nights from 7 to 9, maybe we'll go to 9:30. And that's it. In my earliest days as a session member, we met, and it was from 7 until whenever. Whenever. We had one old guy, Earl Whitmer, if any of you remember Earl Whitmer, who would just, it got to be 10:30, and he said, I'm gone. And you guys keep meeting, and we would keep meeting. It wasn't even like we took them in. So think about and consider meeting more briefly, but more frequently. Improve your meeting dynamics. Hard stops and starts, clear pre-published agendas, focused topics rather than smorgasbords, substantial time, as I said, in sharing hearts and prayer. Not every meeting has to be the same. You can actually focus things. And you heard some of this you probably are already doing, including the use of big blocks of time, retreats and so on to work on the big questions. For us, we work on one of our semi-monthly, twice a month meetings is on kind of big things that we're trying to problem solve. The other is on heart sharing and on just knocking off business items. That's the way that we decided to do it. Embrace constructive disagreement. It's why we're here. We have to figure out how to create a dynamic where we can constructively disagree. I had a guy I used to work with who had a sign in his conference room that said, when two men in business or in a session always agree, one of them is unnecessary. So, there it is. So embrace that. Your moderator, which is usually your pastor, does not always have to be the facilitator. We put our pastors in those kinds of roles, and A, they may not be the best gifted for that role, and B, they never get to actually participate fully, even if it means listening from the sideline. They're always on, they always have to be engaged, they're always having to think about, in addition to how they're trying to lead, how they're trying to facilitate the conversation. It is a really hard thing to do. Give them a break from time to time. Maybe even think about having a designated facilitator as part of that, under the auspices of our Book of Church Order moderator. Use subcommittees to manage your time and your workload. You may already have those, but not as a deflection for conflict avoidance. I don't know how we ought to do that budget. Let's give it to the finance committee. We got a real problem with that stuff. Remember, let's give it to the person. Let's give it to Mikey. He eats everything. So you have to be careful about using subcommittees, but it really is a way to spread the load as far as managing meeting time. Seek mechanisms and practices that create congregational engagement. That's back to that transparency point. There is a real inclination in our sessions to incline towards secrecy and pride. That's my problem. So my question is, either they don't really need to know that, or who are they to question us? And if you're feeling that, if those sentiments come up, step back, ask why are these sentiments coming up? So our practice has been increasingly towards greater transparency with our congregation. Something like a pastor search committee, Well, in the past, we always did that, the session, we picked the search committee, and then tell the congregation, here's who we think ought to be your search committee. Everybody say yes, okay, we're done. Versus last time, it was a full-blown Robert's Rules congregational meeting with nominations and everything. And that felt really exposed. What if the wrong person got named to that search committee? Well, remember the point about being a Calvinist? Yeah. There are ways to get congregational input, surveys, feedback circles, or open forums and Q&As, or involving them in subcommittee work, particularly thinking about how you use and deploy and inform your diaconate if you have one, congregational meetings that are substantive rather than just rubber stamping. So there are lots of mechanisms, and we can talk about that. And then the last idea in terms of sustaining a healthy session I had was you've got to create safe spaces for your pastor. You've got to create that safety. And it's really hard because as I consulted with one church, we love our pastors unconditionally, but we employ them conditionally. And that's the reality. They and their families are living in a fishbowl, and we as sessions have to remember that. And then think about, what does that mean? And how can I create an environment? Back to that sharing of hearts. Is it actually possible to get to the point where a pastor would say, I had a real struggle with X, Y, or Z, particularly as I was preparing for my sermon this last week. And that's just a light one. What if it goes deeper than that? Now, the reality is that may be really hard, even impossible, initially at least, to create within a session, which means you've got to make sure that pastor's got it outside the session. Most of them do, but we talked about for ourselves who is the accountable folks in our lives. Make sure your pastors do as well. Otherwise, it will become a toxic, combative, pathologically spoiled relationship. So you need to figure those things out. The last thing I was going to do is just mention, and this will be my handout, a couple of books. We talked about teams, and this is just an author that I would point you toward, and if you force me to, I'll talk about these things and a couple of models and a couple of lovely assistants.
I'm lovely. You love me, that's what I was about to say.
The author, are any of you familiar with Patrick Lencioni? You should be. His first book was called The 5 Temptations of a CEO. It was recommended to me by a pastor. And I read it and became addicted to this guy. He's a Christian. I think he may be a Catholic, but I think he's still a Christian. If I can say that without violating the Westminster standards. And two of the books that I really like. One is a relatively old one and probably his most popular one. It's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and that's the pyramid at the top of that page, and it talks about different dysfunctions. And so you will see there, for example, the beginning part of the temptation towards invulnerability. That is the absence of trust. If that's a problem for your pastor or for you as a session or for you as an individual, the whole pyramid starts to totter. And so I won't dive into that unless you get me to. But the 5 temptations or 5 dysfunctions of a team talks about general team dynamics. I'd recommend it. And his latest book is called The Ideal Team Player. And that's more of an individual assessment and introspection kind of a book, where it talks about what are the characteristics that I'm looking for someone that I want on this interdependent, effective team. Now, we all have our Timothy and Titus lists, and those are the starting point. So don't think I'm trying to replace any of that. And those lists are primarily about character and who we are, as opposed to what we do. And that's the similar kind of thing, although it shows up in our behavior that Lencioni's talking about in the second book, The Ideal Team Player, where he talks about 3 basic characteristics. If you want to think about how we are performing and how we're interacting with one another, Three things: humility, hunger, and being smart. By which he means humility is pursuing an agenda that's not ours. And as we heard at the opening, it's Jesus' agenda. And it's being other-oriented. It's being the servant leader. And actually, Lencioni even talks about Jesus at the end of the book, which is kind of cool. Hunger is all about going above and beyond versus mailing it in. Where are we hungry? What motivates us to that session meeting? And smart is not either IQ or EQ, if you're another kinds of business book readers. It's just having common sense about people. I suspect that you can think of elders in your circles that have had flaws in one or more of those areas. You know, so if they were not particularly smart about people, it's that either they're the bulldozer kind of charging ahead and causing chaos, bull in the china shop kind of thing, or they're just a pawn. They're just a nice person. So again, I won't dive into his model. I don't have enough time to do that, but I would recommend those as business books that can actually be helpful to how we function in our sessions. And I'll stop, I think, there, because I'm out of time.